Okay. All right. So, oh, I just received it. Fantastic. So I'll introduce you and then pull up the
Okay.
slides.
Okay.
So, hello everyone. We are so happy today to have Gowri Vijayakumar join us for the launch of her new book, At Risk: Indian Sexual Politics and the Global AIDS Crisis. Gowri is an assistant professor of sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies at Brandeis University, Brandeis. Her research and teaching use feminist and transnational perspectives to illuminate the trajectories of social movements, the everyday life of the state, and the political economy of globalization. And she's an amazing sociologist who I've known since I was in graduate school and has done really, really interesting work on the politics of HIV and activism and actually bridging the divide between studying trans women and queers in sex work activism and sex workers. So that's something I'm really excited about. And I will hand it over to you. Without trying to say too much about your book, I'll leave you to say it. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is really special for me to be able to share the book with you all, and both because of knowing Shakti for so long since graduate school, and also because I remember reading Prabha's book while I was doing my field work and how formative it was for me. So it's really means a lot to be able to celebrate my book with you all. So, what I'm presenting today, and I'll just be talking for a short while, is some material from my book. It came out in July, and if anyone has any trouble accessing the book, please email me. It's always difficult to present from a book because there's so much ground to cover, so I probably won't be able to do every argument in the book kind of equal justice, but I'm going to focus today on kind of a broad impression of some of my field work. And then in our discussion, I hope we can kind of delve into some of the things that maybe I wasn't able to address, or any areas that are interesting to anyone who's here. And thank you all for coming. So the global AIDS response is one of the largest global governance projects in history. Funding for HIV/AIDS programs increased from $4.9 billion in 2001 to a peak of $23.3 billion in 2017, and was $21.5 billion in 2020. In today's pandemic world, it's not hard to imagine how a pandemic can upend every aspect of existence. We know how a public health crisis can reconfigure our politics, our aspirations, and our fears, and the ways we care for one another. But when I started my project in the early 2010s, I was often told that AIDS was no longer worth studying. It was not a hot topic anymore. So, in a global context, too, India is perhaps an unexpected place to study HIV. At its peak in 1998, HIV prevalence in India touched 0.5%, and today it's around 0.2%. About 2.1 million people are living with HIV in India now, according to current estimates, which makes it the third largest epidemic in the world. But just as an example, in the early 2000s, 120,000 adults in India died of malaria per year, and 100,000 of AIDS-related causes, so about the same number. But in 2006, donors dispersed $19 million for malaria control and $108 million for AIDS. So AIDS is one of many competing forms of violence and exclusion faced by India's poor people, and that's far beyond disease, of course. Yet in an example of what Adia Benton and others have called HIV exceptionalism, AIDS in India has received outsized attention and funding. So in the early 1990s, globally circulating experts were sure that AIDS was a unique threat to India and that India was the next epicenter of the pandemic. I don't know if you can see the slides that I had, but there's a
slide, so I'm just opening it up.
oh, great. Okay. So anyway, you'll see them in a bit. So, if you look at the headlines from the New York Times in kind of late 80s up to 1996, there was this kind of common narrative about India in the international press. And it was basically that India was a sexually conservative country that was ignoring this epidemiological time bomb that it was sitting on. And by the mid-1990s, Indian and North American AIDS experts agreed that India faced the biggest AIDS epidemic in the world, with 3 million people HIV positive and estimates ranging from 5 to 50 million people by the 2000s. So these were large estimates, and they were later drastically revised down to 2.4 million. So in 2007, the estimate was 2.4 million people living with HIV. During this time, massive global financial resources were infused into the Indian AIDS response. So just to give you a sense, and Shakti, if you don't mind moving forward to the slide with the line graph on it. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So if you look at this graph, the green line is funding for STDs and AIDS, and the gray line is for general health sector aid. So you can see that the AIDS funding in a couple of periods outpaced funding for the entire rest of the health sector in these two moments, 1999 and 2007, which were, these are aid commitments. So they were at the start of each new phase of the Indian National AIDS Control Program. So just to give you a sense of sort of how much of an outsized commitment was being made to AIDS in particular by foreign donors. So India's encounter with AIDS offers an intriguing site to study the intersection of crisis and politics. On the one hand, by the early 2000s, India faced massive amounts of money and political pressure from global governance institutions and donors to respond to what experts said would be a devastating crisis, including from the relatively new global health donor on the scene at the time, the Gates Foundation. On the other hand, the everyday lives of most people were not affected by HIV, and there were many other demands on the state's attention. Another key feature of HIV was that it affected, in particular, groups who were criminalized and marginalized: cisgender women in sex work, transgender women, and men who have sex with men. And in my book, I kind of use this broad set of categories: sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people, which is a overlapping set of terms that I sort of use it to be the broadest. And it includes Indian collective formations such as Koti, Hijra, Armani, etc. And so the AIDS response in India meant some unusual encounters. Shakti, if you could go to the next slide. This is Bill Gates talking with a group of sex workers in Bangalore. This is a publicly available photo, by the way, at a sex worker CBO. So my book works across scales and sites. So I begin with an analysis. If you could go to the next slide. It begins with an analysis of how the AIDS crisis in India was defined in the global field. Sorry, it's actually the slide after this. Okay. Yeah, this is the one, sorry. And then I talk about how the Indian state approached sex workers, first by containing and violently repressing them in the early stages of the AIDS epidemic, and then by incorporating them into the HIV prevention response as peer educators and program designers. And then the third empirical chapter looks at the variety of activist configurations that engaged with the state response, kind of looking at the different types of organizations who became involved. The next chapter looks at how these activist spaces reshaped people's everyday lives. That's the Risky Cells chapter. And then I look at the relationship between India and the global field after the 2010s, when India's HIV response was quantified and circulated as a success story and became a model for HIV prevention in Kenya. So that's the Making It Count chapter. And in the last kind of substantive empirical chapter, I look at the relationships between Kenyan and Indian HIV experts, officials, state officials, and activists, sex workers, sexual minority, and transgender activists, and kind of look at the power dynamics between them, as well as some of the solidarities that emerged between them within this HIV response. And then the conclusion of the book, I look at what all of this meant for the politics of sexuality in India after HIV was considered to be over. So Shakti, if you could go to the previous slide. I'm sorry, I think they're in a different order than they were when I last saved it. So what my book argues is that AIDS cut to the heart of tensions about the kind of nation state India was and could be. AIDS transformed the terrain on which at-risk groups engaged the state and gave them a conditional opening for making demands. And it also reshaped people's everyday lives as they learned new ways of naming, embodying, and practicing sexuality. So ultimately, I show in my book that global institutions' response can transform political life in intimate ways, but not always in a top-down way. So there's always room for contestation and for people to navigate these institutions in creative ways. What I'll focus on now is kind of the first and third arguments here. And I'm happy to talk about the second one as well. And I'm also happy to talk about some of the kind of theoretical framework behind any of this, but I'm leaving that out for now, just in the interest of time. So Shakti, if you could go forward 2 slides, there's like a methods slide. So my research, and so this is just kind of like which chapters I'll be focusing on. Yeah, so my research spanned Bangalore, Kolkata, Nairobi, Delhi, and Chennai, Northern Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Mysore in terms of kind of the interviews that I was able to do. The heart of the project ethnographically was in Bangalore. So that's where most of the basis of this book lies. And Bangalore, I think, was a useful site, especially for a lot of reasons, but especially because it was a high prevalence state in the early days of the HIV epidemic. And so the Gates Foundation designated a focus state for large scale HIV AIDS programs. But there also was kind of this history of other organizing around sexuality before the Gates Foundation arrived. So it's a particularly useful place to study the encounter between kind of sexual politics and this entry of large global donors and global institutional HIV response. So could we go to the next slide? So thank you. And you can press the click again. So in the early 1980s, there was already a debate about whether AIDS in India was really a crisis at all. This question was tied up with India's place in the world order. So what countries could India be compared to? The specter of AIDS was animated by symbolic geography. So on one hand, some commentators compared India to African countries. So if you just click, Shakti, there's like a little excerpt that'll pop up, yeah. So thank you. For example, in 1994, the director of the newly formed National AIDS Control Organization, or NACO, wrote in the Journal of the Indian Medical Association that the trends in Bombay are quite comparable to the trends earlier observed in some of the African states, like Nairobi, Addis Ababa, from mid-80s onwards. The trends are so similar as to forewarn us about the impending epidemic of HIV involving the general population, as has happened in these African countries. So we can go to the next slide. So the other key reference point was the West. There was a binary between Western sexual degeneracy, permissiveness, and material excess, and India's moral virtue. So in this example, you can just click again, an Indian expert told the press that Indian values would ward off AIDS, and gave the example that the homosexuality percentage in India was 5 to 15% homosexuals compared to 40 to 60% in the US. So he positioned India as a monogamous heterosexual nation against the dangers of foreign sex and homosexuality as a Western indulgence. So we also kind of see this image of India as this kind of virtuous, monogamous, heterosexual nation fighting this foreign virus in some of the public health campaigns at the time. So Shakti, if you don't mind just like clicking through the next 2 slides, there are a couple of posters there as an example. Yeah, perfect, thank you. So over time, expert discourses came to focus on a similarity to Africa. India's was a heterosexual epidemic instead of a homosexual epidemic, and India was more like Africa than the West. So if India was like Africa, that also meant that the major vector of HIV was not homosexual populations as in the West, but sex workers. and specifically sex workers defined as heterosexual cisgender women. So once the first case of AIDS was identified in India in 1986, the state began to crack down in particular on sex workers and Africans. I think we can go to the next slide. So for example, the slide after this, thanks. Yeah, so for example, in Tamil Nadu, medical authorities detained some 800 sex workers for mandatory testing and confinement. And they were left with limited food and access to medical care and cut off from their families. There were women who died in confinement. And after an African student was found to be HIV positive, the Indian Ministry of Health announced in October 1986 that AIDS testing was compulsory for all foreign students seeking admission to Indian universities. And by 1987, 11 African students had already been deported. Of course, there was a lot of activism that emerged from this, right? So protests, both from African students and the kind of early pioneering activism that battled against this kind of detainment in Tamil Nadu from SIAP and others. So mechanisms of statistical modeling, citational practice, and transnational research partnerships reinforce these forewarnings of the dangers of sex workers to the nation. So as Manjari Mahajan calls it, this was kind of a form of foreknowledge. And largely North American researchers were the ones who were kind of traveling across South Africa, Kenya, and India, reinforcing the connection between the countries and insisting that the same thing that happened in Africa would also happen in India. So within this global field, India's AIDS epidemic became a heterosexual epidemic, and the heart of the HIV response would focus on sex workers. So we can go to the next slide, thank you. So now I'm gonna fast forward to the point where I did field work kind of in 2012, 2013. So by this time, AIDS programming in India was largely considered to be over. The narrative of India following the path of Africa had been replaced, and the new narrative was India's success in contrast to Africa's failure. So this is one example. This is an article from 2015 that notes how India can look back with some success at its programs in contrast to sub-Saharan Africa. So it was thought to be the next sub-Saharan Africa, but no longer. We can go to the next slide. So for the people I interviewed, this success story wasn't just about preventing disease. It was about the success of the nation state on the world stage. So this is from a high-ranking AIDS official who I interviewed. And he points out that the AIDS response had become a point of national pride. From being a traditional country whose sexual values would protect it from AIDS in the 1980s, India had become a crisis waiting to happen in the 1990s. And finally, by the 2010s, it was a modern nation capable of leading the world with its AIDS response. We can go to the next slide. So here we see some of the news coverage of India's successful AIDS response. So one key argument in my book then is that the AIDS response was fundamentally about where India fit into the world order. And sex workers, and somewhat later on, sexual minorities and transgender people were key to this. They were the ones who had endangered the nation state, and they also became the key to rescuing it. So in the last part of the time I have, I want to move to the offices of HIV prevention programs in Bangalore, where I did my ethnographic field work, to look at how these global negotiations shaped the everyday practices of sexuality and gender of sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people who had been defined as the heart of the AIDS epidemic. I want to show here how HIV prevention programs created an environment in which sexual identities could be embodied, reworked, and contested. So we can go to the next slide. So this is from one of my first interviewees, and he put this most directly. He said, HIV gave me an identity. So the sociologist Chaitanya Lakim Shetty has written about the idea that HIV is a friend to marginalized groups and to sex workers in particular, because it gives them access to political resources. I heard this in many ways in my fieldwork, and it's been documented in the literature as well. People told me HIV was a catalyst and a platform for cisgender women in sex work. The literature on sexual minority and transgender people and their relationship to HIV has been, I would say, slightly more critical. So arguing that HIV programs extended medical surveillance, bioavailability, and disciplined sexual expression. So in looking at both of these groups together, I hope to show how both of these processes converge. So the disciplining of sexuality was at play for all of these groups within HIV programs, but also the formation of new connections, new solidarities, and new political opportunities within that were created by the HIV AIDS response. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to mention 3 concrete ways people's lives were reshaped within HIV prevention drop-in centers: naming sexuality, diversified income, and shared space. So we can go to the next slide. So the first area I wanted to talk about was naming sexuality. So naming sexuality was central to the everyday experience of the HIV prevention workers and activists I interviewed. Regardless of the specific language people used, knowing the category one belonged to was central to the process of becoming an HIV prevention worker and to everyday practice within HIV offices. And if you just click, there's a quotation that will come up. So when someone started as an HIV prevention worker, they attended a counseling session. Many of my interviewees told me that was the first time they heard the term that they now use most often to describe themselves within HIV prevention or activist spaces. And learning how to describe one's identity was an important part of the experience of HIV prevention. So this is a quotation from one of my interviewees who I interviewed in a CBO, and talking about why it's so important for people to know the categories they belong to. And he says they need to have clarity about what I am. I should know I'm a bisexual, and people shouldn't be confused, right? He also talks about sort of through training, understanding the right word to describe himself with. So a second way HIV programs changed the lives of sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people was in diversifying their income. So we can go to the next slide. For example, one of the people I talk about in the book is someone I call Preeti, who identified as a transgender woman. She had done sex work when she lived in the Hijra community after migrating to Bangalore from Shimoga. And she told me that she had changed once she started working in HIV prevention. So even the ways she did sex work changed. So if you click, you can see the quotation from Preeti. So before, she says, I used to spend a lot on clothing. I'd buy the cloth in the morning, get it stitched in the afternoon, and wear that outfit and go out in the evening. The neck would be this deep, and I'd pull the veil up like this. And she kind of showed me pulling up the dupatta high up so her breast would be on display. She said, back then, that was my only job. Sex work was my only way of earning. But now I don't make the neck deep. I go and sit at the bar, I start drinking, and then they come to me on their own. I say I work in an HIV prevention NGO. So one of the things I want to note here, and one of course, is the way that Preeti kind of learned to embody a more respectable feminine embodiment when she was doing sex work, right? A more contained version of sexuality that also has kind of caste and class inflections to it. But also that her income being more diverse is at the heart of this, right? So she says sex work was my only way of earning before. And now as an HIV prevention worker, she has a sort of different way of approaching sex work, which actually allows her to feel more in control of the way that she navigates interactions as a sex worker. So we can go to the next slide. So a final element of how HIV prevention programs helped mobilize new kinds of sexual identities was shared space. So the drop-in center was a central part of HIV prevention programs in the experience of those I interviewed. They served a purpose in allowing sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people to gather privately away from public spaces that could often be sites of violence and harassment. Once they crossed the threshold of the office, people moved their bodies more fluidly, the boundaries between bodies seemed less rigid, people snuggled or played with each other's hair, rested their heads on one another's laps or shoulders, and joked or argued or danced to songs playing on the TV for hours on end. We can go to the next slide. Some offices had an area with Hindu idols for small pujas. In some cases, people used the office to conduct sex work indoors as well, away from the threat of police harassment. So from a safe and private location, sex workers had room to negotiate with clients. And I saw this many times, kind of sharing clients, laughing over unexpected experiences, and comparing notes about rates and services. And importantly, this protected location also made it easier to refuse a client. So an office meant a place to be able to kind of compare notes and also decide, no, I don't want to see this client, and to be still protected within the space of the office. An office meant shared space to confer over clothes, makeup, and jewelry. So it was a place where people discussed kind of what it meant to embody transgender sexuality, for instance. It became a space for developing new ways of naming sexuality, new forms of solidarity and care and support, and new forms of embodiment. So what I hope I've conveyed here is that these processes were disciplining in the sense they sort of pushed people to embody sexuality in more respectable kind of middle class ways that somewhat narrowed the kind of scope of sexual expression and gender expression. But at the same time, they also opened avenues for making demands in their everyday lives and on the state, both individually and collectively. So people described sort of learning how to speak up, learning how to talk to police officers, learning how to stand up to their own partners or their families or clients. And so both of these things were happening at the same time within HIV prevention spaces. So I know I'm almost out of time. In my last few minutes, I just wanted to briefly reflect on kind of the last part of my book, which focuses on this idea of after AIDS. So we can go to the next slide. So many of the activists I interviewed were well aware that all the funding and access to resources they had during the HIV epidemic was temporary. So even though these groups remained marginalized and faced exclusion and violence on an everyday basis, Bill Gates only visited them when they were central to the AIDS response. So here, one of my interviewees points out the conditionality of the AIDS response. We can just click to see the quotation. So he says, "The minute you bring HIV down to zero, you'll not be funded, no one will care about you, you'll be back to being a pariah of society." Yeah, hello? Shakti?
Hey, yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I just saw a message from you. Yeah, it's only a matter of time. If the situation comes, they drop these women like hot potatoes. So we can go to the next slide. So 2 years after my field work, I visited one of the women I became most close to in 2012, and I'm using this photo with her permission. This is Lata, I call her Lata in the book. And I took the photo at the bangle shop she owned at the time. You wouldn't know from a casual conversation that Lata spent 8 years as an HIV peer educator and later a sex worker activist who traveled all over the country. Reflecting on it in 2015, though, she said, and you can click again, her quotation is here, and one more time. She said, what feels unjust in what they did is that they brought us all out and then they left us. And you can click one more time. There's one more quotation. So they came and did something and they left, and we still have to be here. So I kind of want to end here because I think it sort of captures the paradoxical condition of crisis politics, right? So the threat to the Indian nation posed by the global crisis forced the state and donors to pay attention to people like Lata. After the crisis was over, sex workers were no longer at the heart of what it meant for India to be a modern nation, and they could go back to being marginalized and criminalized and competing kind of in the everyday democratic tangle, right? And also the context of increasing political opposition. To me, this is why it is especially important to make sense of how the AIDS response reshaped everyday life, as well as kind of collective political life for sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people in India. Because even after the crisis, the AIDS response left behind some legacies, right? Small transformations in sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people, and how they imagine themselves and how they imagine their connections to others and how they imagine their relationship to the state. So I will stop here. There's one more slide, I think, just with my email address in case anybody wants to reach out with questions. But I'll end here. Thanks so much, Shakti, for moving the slides along.
Beautiful. it's my pleasure now to just offer a few thoughts on this extraordinary book. Thank you for your terrific presentation, Gowri. And I really enjoyed reading your book. I read it fast, but I really, really enjoyed it. It was quite gripping. And I would strongly recommend it as a very beautifully written and theoretically engaging ethnography, which makes a really important contribution to many aspects of scholarship on sex work and AIDS in the post-colonial context. So, so the two sort of, well, I could make a few comments, but the two main comments are really related to what stood out for me from your book. So I think the mobilization around HIV/AIDS has been sort of an inescapable backdrop against which sex work researchers in India have had to work for almost 30 years now. So it's you see it's the dominant sort of context, and over the years right from meeting I.S. Gilada at the start of the AIDS when AIDS first came to India, to seeing how very core members of say groups like DMSC had become consultants for HIV programs for care and so on, to losing them over a period of time, and they never came back to you just see that HIV is really, really important in the context of how sex work is understood and how sex workers are mobilized. But I think the kind of theorization of what it has really meant for the sex worker community is only now emerging. And I think your book really makes a valuable contribution to it. So, there's been a gap in the sort of scholarly literature, but you track very clearly, the global scene, what you call the global AIDS field. You're looking at the global, you're tracking the funding, you're looking at how that gets operationalized from a global level at a domestic level, and then how it basically, sorry, have I frozen or am I still there? I'm there. Okay. And how it gets translated into social movement organizations, and then also community-based organizations. What's happening really at the sort of micro level of these peer educators who are part of the HIV sort of prevention army. I think this is, and going beyond the question of containment and incorporation. So one could theorize this process at a sort of macro level in terms of social movement theory, in terms of the kind of resources that HIV made available, in terms of the political opportunity that emerged for HIV prevention, and the kind of cognitive liberation it produced for sex workers to come out and say, in different parts of the country that they were sex workers with pride. But I think what your work really does is also offers a very powerful account of the micro processes through which this has happened. So your ethnography, which you've just shared very beautifully, of naming sexual practices, of this issue of diversified income and of shared spaces, really adds to this macro level kind of intuition, rather, I would say, of how HIV prevention efforts have actually, helped mobilize or given certain windows of opportunity for sexual minorities and for sex workers. I think what I really liked about your book also is that it speaks about the institutional level shifts. So you talk about this idea of segmented institutionalization, where you're talking about how NACO is able to circumvent, older public health bureaucracies and trying to grapple with the issue of HIV, and then quickly realizing that they can't manage to successfully implement their programs unless they relied fundamentally on communities on the ground. So I think this is very, very useful, I think, for researchers in this field. I guess the kind of question that I wanted to pose for you is also that I think for those of us working in the sex work field, also we know that there is a huge countervailing international dynamic as well in play, which is that of anti-trafficking initiatives, which emerges maybe 10, 15 years after the HIV global programs, but also India features as a recipient of a considerable amount of US funding. So between 2000 and 2013, reportedly out of $4 billion in overseas development assistance, India received about 19 million a year, only behind, ranked only behind Afghanistan. Now, of course, what you just said in your presentation today was, you're talking about $100 million, which is, several times what, this $20 million for anti-trafficking work is. But I guess I was just curious about how you made sense of these two large competing global governance projects, because clearly abolitionists also made deep inroads into state institutions. So, rather than having an independent government organization, in the case of HIV, in the case of trafficking, obviously the state literally outsourced its policing work, and so you have a very unholy alliance between NGOs and the police, and they're really working very closely together, in producing SOPs, in actually carrying out raids, rescue and rehabilitation, going to court, and they're repeat players in various sort of state sides. And you talk very beautifully about the state being a multifaceted, sort of internally contradictory institution. So I'd really love to hear more about the points of opposition between these two global governance projects. I realize this is not your central goal, but most of us see only bits of this confrontation. Clearly, as a lawyer, it came up, when the amendment to the ITPA was proposed in 2005, and simply produces dissonance at the highest level of power within the union cabinet. But I'm just curious whether on the ground at these sites of struggles that you were looking at, whether these two governance projects had parallel, inhabited sort of parallel worlds, or whether they were constantly, sort of in contestation with each other. So that was just one question. The second thing that I really enjoyed about your book was how you decenter the West. I think it's a fantastic couple of chapters that you present on India and Kenya, and it's a fascinating story of how you're talking about the foreknowledge that's generated in Kenya, which gets then transposed to India, and then the so-called successful Indian model of HIV prevention gets exported back to Kenya. And I think this move of, we often think of these global governance projects very much in terms of the global and the national, but I think you very productively set up, this kind of comparative lens, so I found that very, very insightful, actually. And of course, you talk about how, the Indian model, which is, is data-driven, but also has this very strong political context in which sex workers and sexual minorities were able to mobilize, that gets transported very technocratically to the Kenyan context. And there's, so the political core of the Indian model gets sort of hollowed out. And you talk about, you attributed to a range of kind of reasons, which I thought were really wonderful. One is about the institutional and funding factors. So, much more of the HIV prevention funding for Kenya came from USAID, and therefore was subject to, things like the prostitution pledge, unlike India, which got only a percentage of its funding from the US. And a higher percentage from the Indian government itself. You talk about cultural factors, which were also fascinating. You give this example of, if there were a traffic jam in Nairobi, people would just sit patiently and wait for it to disappear. Whereas in India, people would just spill out into the roads and create another traffic jam of their own. So, and then you talk about the political culture, you talk about the religious context, you talk about sexual cultures. Again, very unstable. It's like a very unstable idea. And sometimes it seems like, the Kenyans are more open. Sometimes it seems like they're more closed, and you can hardly find sex workers. So clearly, you also then talk about how importing the Indian model to Kenya created spaces for connection and mutual support. So I just think all of this was so productive. I also wondered whether, alongside transporting the HIV prevention model, if one thought about not so much as import-exporting, but just kind of collaborating over these forms of political mobilization. Could one say that the Indian model of, sex worker organization is also quite exceptional in many ways? And, given your methodology of doing this kind of multi-sited research, what you thought were the prospects for more sort of in-depth exchanges between, social movements across, contexts which share quite a lot, I think, in common, certainly as lawyers, we know that there is a whole set of, African countries where, the common law operates, and, and that matters quite a lot for the way that, sex work is regulated. So I was just very curious about what you thought the prospects for that kind of real exchange of ideas in terms of mobilization would be. So I think there's a couple of other questions that I had. I guess one of the things that you mentioned, sort of philanthrocapitalism, only once, I think, in passing in the book, and I think it seems to be quite key to both sets of global governance projects. I mean, certainly in the context of trafficking, although Andrew Forrest isn't, kind of planted himself in India like Bill Gates did, I think there is a whole sort of narrative about, how do these movements connect up with the advance of neoliberal capitalism and philanthrocapitalism. I'd just be very curious to hear your thoughts on that. But thank you again. Thank you for a really, really wonderful book. So I think maybe we can have a couple of more questions and thoughts, and then you can respond to us if that's okay.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? You can see. Feel free to raise your hand or just type your question into the chat. I had one other question actually, Gowri, also following on Prabha. Like, I would love to hear just a little bit more about the argument with respect to Kenya and this, tracking it from the 80s and then later, like this kind of radical reversal, which kind of tracks, 3 decades of a conversation that was happening, not mediated directly through gates or something. And so a conversation a lot of us haven't attended to as carefully as you have, and I would love to hear that. As Prabha said, that kind of work is sorely lacking. Yeah.
We can't hear you.
I think, yeah, we're not able to hear you, Gowri. I don't know why. Did she leave?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Okay, well, should I respond or would it be better to wait for other questions? I could respond based on what based on Prabha and Shakti's comments. Yeah, I mean, I think Prabha, this question about the anti-trafficking, almost because it's such a big, it's such a huge alternative structure of, funding and discourses and global links. It almost felt like it was, too much to take on in one project. But I completely agree with you. I mean, basically, and I think others have shown this, like Kimberly Walter's work. Part of what she's looked at is how some of the CBOs kind of after HIV funding reduced, they actually switched gears and went from kind of saying sex worker rights and sex workers empowerment to basically an anti-trafficking framework, because that's where the funding went. And I think that makes the precarity, I think, of community-based organizations in the face of these powerful funding structures particularly clear. What I kind of try to talk about a little bit in the book toward the end is kind of how after the height of HIV funding, of course HIV is still there, but the height of HIV funding has reduced. And I've also looked at this a little bit in the context of COVID. Some of the organizational infrastructures of organizing around HIV have actually been crucial in terms of, being able to mobilize against some of these new attempts to criminalize, new anti-trafficking bills, et cetera. A lot of the leading activists, as you mentioned, Prabha, came out of, initially developing their political resources during the HIV epidemic, not as a direct result, but in the context of HIV, they developed political resources and then were able to mobilize them in new ways, against some of these legal attacks. And I think that I think that the segmented institutionalization concept helps too, because when NACO was this kind of powerful counterweight, it was there was less kind of as you said, the Ministry of Women and Child Development has kind of given over its tasks to anti-trafficking organizations and donors, and NACO was a counterweight, and like a literal counterweight in 2006 in court. But even kind of in the sense of being an alternative voice or perspective, and and that segmented institutionalization is sort of limited to that space. So once the crisis is over, there's less of a counterweight, right? And so now we're really seeing kind of, I think, the lack of the same kind of institutional alternative, which means that what's left is kind of the organizing that happened on the ground, but not so much the same political opportunity structure, to use kind of political process theories language. So I think that's what I would say about it. In my context, like in terms of micro experience, studying in Bangalore when I was there, anti-trafficking organizations weren't actually as, I hesitate to say this because it wasn't my area of research, but at least in the spaces I was in, it seemed like there was actually an active kind of conversation across groups that were doing anti-trafficking work and sex workers' rights group. Like I remember one time I went with some people from a sex worker activist organization to this anti-trafficking meeting, and like there was this big debate and a discussion, and they almost seemed to be kind of on parallel tracks. But also I think it's important to remember that policing, is very uneven, and I think your work shows this as well. So it can be a new police commissioner who decides to crack down, and then there can be a period of retreat, and so there's so many other factors shaping sort of when anti-trafficking and policing efforts kind of pick up for sex workers on the ground, and when they're sort of less present. So now a lot of people in Bangalore say policing has again become more intense in recent years, and partly because of COVID. That is a dynamic they're particularly facing, which was kind of, I think, like had been in retreat during the time when I was doing field work. So the other question you had was about collaborations and sort of South-South partnerships, or ways that the Indian approach to HIV could be a basis for collaboration, and particularly in places in Kenya where I did research. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I was doing fieldwork in Kenya, there was this kind of, it was like a global donor funded effort to share resources, but it was happening in this way that, as you really beautifully summarized, Prabha, didn't, take into account that the political process in India was this, long organic effort that came out of grassroots organizations, and it came out of very particular political contexts. And so it's not something that can just be kind of codified and translated into a new place. But when I was doing research in Kenya, I also found that there were all of these organizations and sex workers who had been, connected to each other, not through organizations, but sort of through informal support networks, who had been there and who kind of felt like now there was a political opportunity for them because of this new effort for the state was making to take key populations, as they're called in Kenyan policy, more seriously. And I did hear activists saying that they learned from Indian sex worker activists in that. So they would say, well, if they can do this, we can do this too. We've actually been doing this for a long time. And recently, the effort to decriminalize sodomy in Kenya. John Mathenge, who was one of the leaders of that effort, he said publicly that India was an inspiration for that effort, and it wasn't successful, but I think it's an example of how there is this possibility for interaction across these boundaries, and often the interaction among activists, and I think like many of the people I interviewed within government acknowledged that they're the most productive when activists are interacting. And to the extent that activists are able to interact through the platform of HIV, it enables some of these solidarities. So I'll pause there because I feel like I'm talking a lot. Are there others?
We also had a question. Arvind, did you want to share your question?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, so thank you, Gowri. I really enjoyed your talk. It was quite enlightening. And it's interesting, as Prabha mentioned, that, sex workers were seen as collaborators in the HIV prevention programs. But when it came to trafficking, they were seen as pariahs. In fact, I remember in 2018, when the trafficking bill was debated in Parliament, the minister dismissed the critique of the trafficking bill of other parliamentarians by saying that, they are representatives of sex workers. And other MPs in Parliament started sneering and laughing when they heard that. I'm not sure whether your research looked at these points. I just wanted to know if you came across it. But in your study, how important do you think was the access to medicines such as PrEP for HIV prevention programs, both in India and in Kenya? Because I have also heard about some people have concerns that even though PrEP is very useful in reducing HIV transmissions, it may also give a false sense of confidence of engaging in risky forms of sexual intercourse without condoms or other protections. And another question which I did have was, did you see the role of, say, religious institutions or religious groups, either as supporters or as obstacles for HIV prevention programs, both in India or in Kenya? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sorry, and your first question was about how basically the contradictory nature of the state and how sex workers are sort of painted in such different ways by the same institutions. Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons that I really did, because I think and Prabha, you were kind of like framing this and using political process theory, and I think it's or speculating about what a political process theory approach might look like with political opportunities and resources, etc. And one of the places I think political process theory sometimes is limiting is that the state is this very kind of unitary actor, and here we do have this very kind of bifurcated, more than bifurcated, it's a very conflictual relationship to sexuality within the state, and often kind of and this is even in the colonial period, right? In moments of crisis around venereal disease, there are these kind of state efforts that are cut off from the rest of the sexual morality of the rest of the state. So one, arm of the state, the public health arm, that's sort of, attempting to engage sexuality, and others that are sort of violently repressing it at the same time. And I would say, I think so within I did interview some anti-trafficking people, just a few, because it wasn't my main focus when I was doing my research. And yeah, I think like on the ground I think this is also why it's important to kind of think about the state beyond the state and pay attention to kind of organizational, associational life, because, one of the things I was kind of surprised by, especially in Kolkata, talking to an anti-trafficking advocate, she was like, well, we don't get to do anything because DMSC controls this whole city. Like, we have no power here at all. And, of course, looking at it from the outside, that's not what it looks like. But, I think these are arenas of struggle, right? And so I think, and especially in terms of how law is lived and experienced by sex workers, is often kind of just as much about collective organization as it is about, what the state's stated intentions are very different from how they're experienced. So so I think that is the kind of analysis of the state that I hope the book gives. About religious institutions, interestingly, I mean, HIV kind of brought, the thing about HIV is it sort of brings together some unlikely support, right? So there were some, early on there, I think there were some discourses about like Indian culture, definitely sort of draws on this idea of like Hindu purity and stuff, even some ads, public service announcement type images that really kind of draw on Hindu iconography in the early HIV response. I don't know. I think, I think it's different in Kenya, right? So the organizations I talked to in Kenya were actually, they felt very much attacked by religious organizations, and their offices were, one office was like set on fire, and people thought that it was like religious actors who were behind it, in both Christian and Muslim opposition, both like through the state and informally. So so there, I think that feels more immediate in Kenya, and in India I think the religious landscape is so much more complicated, and now of course I think has to be read through the context of kind of the current administration and Hindutva. And then your last question was about the politics of treatment. And so I don't say too much about it in the book because, again, it wasn't my focus, and partly because, HIV prevention in India for a long time was so focused on prevention. The majority of the program was really focused on prevention. But drugs are widely available, and I think PrEP is available too now. So I mean, whether it creates a false sense of security, I mean, my sense is that people have the right to use whatever tools they have, So I'm less concerned about, I would be less concerned about false sense of security than kind of global access to the same, medical resources that anybody in the, in San Francisco or New York has to protect themselves from HIV. But, as we know, the politics of drug access are very complicated and often very unjust. Was there another hand up? And I don't know.
Shraddha, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you for this wonderful question. You had mentioned that the movement again kind of was catalyzed by the AIDS movement. So I was wondering, when you said that now AIDS is no longer considered to be an urgent issue in India, do you think that was also influenced by the different decisions of the High Court and also the Supreme Court in decriminalizing 77? Was it in any way affected by it?
Sorry, you were breaking up a little bit, so I didn't catch the whole question. I'll try to repeat what I thought I heard. Or do you want to?
Yeah, I can just do that. So you had mentioned that the movement, the AIDS movement, helped catalyze and kind of build a coalition of queer issues, and also kind of argue against 377, like argue for its decriminalization. So I was wondering the different decisions by the High Court and the Supreme Court when they decided to decriminalize same-sex relationships. Do you think that kind of had an effect of reducing the issue of AIDS? Did that make?
Oh, I see. So was it? Okay. Oh, I see. So did decriminalization affect the narrative that AIDS was no longer an issue? I mean, I think actually. So I was doing fieldwork 2012, 2013. So it was the period between like decriminalization and kind of recriminalization, I guess, between 2009 and 2013. So yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, I think they were happening on separate tracks, right? So the first time that that 377 was debated, HIV was a much bigger part of the debate, right? And I think others have written about this, like Jyoti Puri's book kind of talks about this, that HIV, NAS Foundation, obviously was a big part of bringing, and before NAS Foundation, AIDS Bhedbhav Virodi Andolan. So yeah, AIDS was a big part of that that debate and that case. And then later on, by I guess 2018, AIDS was not as much a part of the debate. So and the argument was actually much more about kind of inclusion and transformative constitutionalism. It was just a different, the whole debate had a different tenor to it, and so I think, and the right to privacy. So yeah, so I think that AIDS was kind of happening. The global institutional expertise around HIV and its decline, and India as a success story, really started happening like in 2010-ish. Maybe to put a date on it. It was before before some of the like legal advances that you're mentioning. So I don't think that there was a direct effect in that way. I will say, like, one thing that Jyoti Puri talks about as well is that, HIV actually, made the case in a way weaker because it was less focused on kind of a broader human rights claim. It was really like, decriminalize sodomy to make HIV easier to prevent. And so, yeah, so the later debates kind of actually broadened and deepened the conversation. So I think, yeah, I guess that's what I would say. But I think, again, when we look at organizational processes, these arenas are so entangled, right? So the activists who were involved in 377 were also involved in HIV prevention, right? These arenas are so closely intertwined. And so I think that's part of, what I hope to do in the book is really assess, what does that mean that the same organizations, the same processes, the ways that people talk about sexuality, that they develop through being part of HIV prevention, especially working class people, right? Who kind of, because there's also the elite LGBT movement, but the working class movement, people come in through HIV often. And so what does that mean for how they engage with these struggles, I think is one of the core questions that I'm interested in. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, great. Do we have any? Oh, okay. We have one question from Sriram. Sriram, yeah, feel free to.
Yeah, can I?
Yep.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Gowri, thanks a lot for your time, and I'm sure I'll get around to reading your book. But during the period of your research for the book, I think it was around 2011, 2012, that all programs, got transitioned to the government. And before that, there were a whole lot of foreign funding that was pouring into the HIV field on prevention, specifically. And all that kind of was put on hold, and the government said, we will take over prevention. Do you think, and from there, there has been a steady decline in the way the program was being funded, and the funds were reducing from that point of time. So do you think that there is some connection between the fact that the government took over the onus on prevention, that we see this decline? Could you capture the kind of, what happened with the stopping of the foreign funding? You had DFID, you had UNAIDS, you had Gates Foundation, you have a whole lot of people who were funding before that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Yeah, so I think you've captured the moment when I was doing field work so well. I mean, I was kind of there when the handover was in progress. So some places the handover hadn't happened, some places they had, some places, the state was taking over, some places were still run by, like in my case, KHBT, and some of the, some CBOs had taken over. In some cases, NGOs were still running things. So, all of these different levels of handover were kind of happening while I was doing field work, which made it an interesting time to be doing these interviews, because people were really talking about, these dynamics of the state and global funders and what global funders had meant in this arena. Yeah, so I do think that, the huge amount of foreign funding had effects on how the state treated HIV, right? It kind of treated it as this exceptional case that had institutions that were walled off from other institutions, strategies that were not used in other, working with sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people, and hiring them as peer educators, but then them being criminalized in by other institutions of the state. So yeah, and then after global funding declined and things were handed over to the state, this exceptionalism kind of disintegrated, right? So, and I mean, HIV is one of many public health issues, right? As I was kind of mentioning in the beginning. So yeah, and in the scheme of things, it sort of makes sense that this decline in attention would happen. But when I went back, I did interviews in 2015 and 2017 with some of the people I had interviewed in 2012 and 2013, and a lot of them, and I kind of alluded to this at the end of my talk, felt very abandoned by the government, right? And they felt like, now that the government had taken over, that meant, like, even bureaucratically, like salary delays, all kinds of bureaucratic delays, more paperwork to fill out, and kind of lower pay in some cases, and like things like, I don't know, and people would say, like, we used to get like biryani and we had all this like nice food and ice cream in the drop-in center, and now it's just like there's nothing and there's no resources. So yeah, I mean, I think like in this exceptional period, people felt like they were really getting all of these resources to organize, and after and just to be together and sort of be in the drop-in center, and then after the handover to government. But I think it's like, so it's not, I wouldn't say it's just because of the state that the decline happened. It's also because of this, within this global field, HIV overall is also, being, it still receives a lot of funding, but, the peak of seeing HIV as a global crisis has ended. And I think the larger question I want to ask is, what does it mean that sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people in this context, and I think this probably most applies to sex workers, actually, because sexual minorities and transgender people have other activist networks and maybe other access to global institutions. But sex workers in particular, what does it mean that, if you have to be at risk of HIV in order to be getting like biryani in the office and this like meetings with the police commissioner and things like that, why is being at risk of HIV your ticket to being a citizen, right? And so I think that the whole framework of the global funding for HIV being the basis for citizenship shows how crisis, it reveals these kind of political contradictions and this very deep exclusion that's at the heart of it. So I hope that answers your question. And I'd love to hear what you think about it too.
Okay, so yeah, thanks so much, Sriram, for that question, and to all of you. And Gowri, again, yeah, thank you for joining us. And I'm glad we got to see your slides because they were so lovely, especially the last one. No, all of them. But yeah, thank you everyone, and I think we'll wrap up here, and you know where we are, so feel free to stay in touch.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Bye.
So, thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Gowri. Thank you.
Bye. Oh.